Across the country, state legislatures are in session, which means somewhere right now, a very tired legislative aide is adjusting a sunset date by 3 years. Again. And that small tweak could determine whether Design Build Authority expands or tightens. From progressive design build expansion in Arizona to sunset extensions in Illinois and threshold removals in Missouri, 2026 is shaping up to be another consequential year for state-level design build policy. Some states are refining mature programs, others are moving from pilot programs to full authority, and in a few places we're watching for that sneaky little bill that could change the landscape. I am Erin Looney, and in this episode of the Design Build Delivers podcast, I'm joined by Richard Thomas, DBIA's Director of State and Local Legislative Affairs, and Vince Campanella, Chair of DBIA's Legislative Committee and VP at Leidig Construction. We get into expansion, pressure points, why bad bills never really disappear, and what all of this means for owners and teams trying to plan their next project. And as always, a thank you to our sponsor, Archons, an Autodesk Platinum partner, for making the Design Build Delivers podcast possible. Now, let's get to Richard and Vince. So across the country this year so far, we are seeing everything from expanded design build authority to tighter procurement rules. For people listening now, whether they're owners, designers, contractors, somebody just kind of wondering what design build is, what is actually at stake in 2026 in terms of state and local legislation?
Obviously, we're seeing a continuation of expanding design build across the country into new market sectors in certain locations, certain states. We're seeing the expansion of progressive, which is fantastic. That's been a focus of advocacy and DBIA board for a number of years now. So we're starting to see more and more of that. So the successes of the progressive design build projects that people are doing are starting to really manifest themselves now in people continuing to want to do this and seeing the expansion. We're continuing to push for continued expansion of authority across the country into sectors that aren't there now, market sectors that we don't see it. And we're also seeing a lot of changes in sunset clauses. Legislation, sometimes they'll have a timeline to them where the authority has to be reauthorized by the legislature in certain timelines. We're starting to see that either those sunset clauses go away or to be extended, which is great news. We're not seeing a lot of restriction, which is fantastic. That's always the concern, is that legislators start to clamp down on authority. And we're not seeing that, which is very good.
You know, we've really had a lot of momentum the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of expansion, particularly on the progressive side. And I think we're in a position where we can continue to push forward there. I mean, one of the things coming into this year we were somewhat concerned about is we do have a lot of turnover in the legislature. So it was important to have boots on the ground right away, reaching out to a lot of these new legislatures. And I think we're well positioned going into 2026.
Well positioned is good. And we'll talk more about sunset clauses coming up. So let's keep that one in mind. Looking broadly right now, though, how do you think this year's landscape, how do you think the legislation you're seeing so far is going to change how projects are delivered?
I think this year, what we're really going to see is we're going to see a lot of projects. And we're going to see a lot of projects that are delivered quicker. It seems like forever since we passed the infrastructure bill at the federal level, but actually only about a quarter of all of that funding has been delivered yet. So what we're starting to see is, I think particularly in the water and transportation sectors, where a lot of these big projects, they're just ending their procurement phase or they're just started the construction phase. So I think we're going to have a lot of case studies to talk about over the next couple of years here.
What we're seeing is just a continuation of design build as a preferred delivery method. I think success breeds success. So when there's good projects, when public owners in certain states have great success with design build, the word gets out through their associations, through just the way that they talk. You know, it's one of those things where nobody wants to be the last guy to try something. So if we can just continue to spread the word and we continue to have success with all the projects, public and private, we're just going to continue to see design build being the preferred method of delivering projects.
So looking a little bit at we've looked at the whole country. Let's bring it down to individual spots now. What are you seeing so far to be the real pressure points? And are we talking here mostly about expansion, like you've mentioned, or are we defensive in any of these pressure places?
I would say that we have all of the above going on all of the time.
Fair enough.
Well, because all of these states they all have different cultures. They're all at different stages of design build development. I think there's going to be a lot of states that have mature programs that we're going to be refining in those cases where we're trying to codify best practices. A lot of states that, well, we'll talk about some of them in a bit, where maybe they had full authority, but they didn't have, they had a gap with progressive. We're going to talk about this shortly too. We have a few states where we're still dealing with sunsets and pilot programs becoming full programs. I think it's really kind of a mix. The one thing I was pleasantly surprised is I thought we would be on the defense a little bit more this year because of the turnover, but I think since we got to a lot of these new members early, that put us in a good place.
It's interesting. We joke about playing defense, but it's real. Richard and the advocacy folks look for the language in the bills every year that's going to potentially impact authority. And some of the stuff's very, very subtle. But we saw a couple of years ago in Virginia where they tried to restrict authority, and we saw it in Texas, where they wanted to bring the number of projects that were authorized for design build, and I think it was DOT, right, Richard?
Yes.
Texas DOT down. So, fortunately, the trend is for expansion and not restricting authority, but you always have to be on the lookout for just that sneaky little bill or the sneaky language that is going to impact authority. And once it starts, it can gain some momentum. So that's the stuff where we try to really knock it down early.
Texas is a good example. There's a good chance we will see that bill again,
right.
So we're already starting to prep for that. And that's one of those things too, where, elections matter. Depending upon how elections shake out too, that could really greatly affect on whether we're going to be on the defense or the offense.
Let me ask a follow-up before we look at some specific states. When you have to revisit a bill, especially one that you don't love, do you go in with the same strategy? Do you change the plan completely, or do you have to feel it out first and see what might actually hit?
That's a good question. And really, that's something you have to revisit. Minnesota's a good example. Minnesota had a leadership change. Their legislature is tied at 67 to 67 in the House. So now they have co-chairs. Our chair last year was a Republican, this year a Democrat. So while we have a lot of the same folks on the committee, the leadership has changed a little bit. So that means there's some subtle nuances that are different in how we deal with the different leadership, and also because the different caucuses have different priorities, you have to deal with that. The good thing with that, though, kind of power sharing deal is they do have to do things in a bipartisan way, and that's generally how we like to do things anyways.
I just imagined you guys feeling like you were beating your heads against the wall, having to revisit the same bill over and over and say, why doesn't somebody just get this? But it sounds like that is a very simplified way to look at something way more complex than that. Vince, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I guess I've been around this long enough to know that bad bills never go away. They just get kind of reintroduced in a different manner, sometimes with different language. But if the legislator or the senator, whoever at the state level wanted something and they didn't get what they wanted one year, they have a long memory. They never seem to forget.
So it's no different in this industry than anywhere else.
Right. That's very true. Very, very true. And legislators sometimes are worse than others.
Vince really nailed it there. I mean, generally the bills that we see the most often where you generally don't have to change your strategy are the bad bills that come every year. Up until this year, we've had a bad bill introduced every year in the Virginia legislature that would strip away local design build authority. And it's one of those that you can beat them down, but then if you have a turnover where you have new people, and if you don't go back and talk to those new people, things can slip by.
Or if you remind them on a podcast and it comes back up in their minds, you might have just kicked it off again.
Exactly.
You may have to name drop it, see if you can stay them into it.
So we're not going to talk about Virginia specifically until the very end, just a little bit. So there are 5 states we're going to spend a little bit of time on. So let's get to those now. We'll start with Missouri. There's SB 1484 and HB 2474. Those numbers you can see in the show notes because you probably aren't going to remember them from listening. Those would authorize PDB, Progressive Design Build, and they'd remove the $7 million threshold for certain projects. So if those pass, how does that change the opportunity and the competition on the ground in Missouri?
With the progressive portion of that, with its passage, all of those owners that didn't have progressive authority, I think particularly in the water sector, they're going to use it immediately. I think with the second part of that now, that I think, again, it's going to be used immediately, but for different reasons. When we first passed that bill, which me and a few others at DBIA were intimately involved in, we write this bill, and this was my least favorite portion because this was an obvious political cutout that was part of the compromise. But where it was disappointing was we knew there were local governments at that time that wanted to use design build on smaller projects, particularly road projects. So they've waited 10 years for this. This, I think, is probably, people don't focus upon. This is something that for me is pretty sublime if it's passed, just because we knew this was good. It was good policy to begin with, and it just didn't happen because of politics.
You don't get a lot of sublime these days.
No, especially in politics.
No. And the thresholds are something that we see that a lot, especially when states or local governments are starting. They'll put like a minimum threshold. In Washington State, ours was 10 million for a long time. The project had to be at least 10 million in value in order to be qualified for design build. That's not an abnormal starting point, is to see a threshold, a minimum threshold. But more and more we're seeing, we did the same thing here in Washington, where public owners want to use design build for small projects and even smaller scope specific projects. And as a great example, one of the larger users here in Washington State is our university system, University of Washington, Washington State University. They're probably the two largest single users of progressive design build in our state. They really politicked for the threshold to be removed. And so we did a pilot project for WSU where they could use design build all the way down to $2 million. And they did a number of projects, renovation projects, and very scope specific things like elevator replacements, where they would hire a design builder based upon an elevator company, and then they would design around the elevator, which turned out to be very successful. And same thing, re-roofing projects, those kind of things. I mean, they've done probably 5 or 6 over the last 3 or 4 years, progressive design build projects on very scope specific things. And my understanding is they've been very, very successful. Good competition. And again, with progressive, you're designing around a specific product ultimately, which is more cost effective and a lot more time effective in delivering the project. So it's been great.
And they tend to win awards from us. So apparently we think they're doing something right too.
Design build works so good in small projects and even just scope specific projects where a design builder can bring in a specific team that is expert in that particular item or particular type of scope. And again, you got the experts at the table right off the bat, and you're designing around a specific solution. So you're going to be more cost effective and more time sensitive than you can be under any other delivery method.
Absolutely.
And it works.
It seems to be working. In another state, in Illinois, we have a sunset clause related bill there. It's HB 5090 that extends the Design Build Procurement Act sunset. And there's also the SB 3381 HB 4951. Again, these numbers, I'm just putting them out there so we know which bills we're talking about. If you want to see those by name, I will put all that in the show notes for anyone listening who's like, stop with the numbers. I get it. But that bill would expand design build authority for water commissions. We've mentioned water and we've mentioned sunset so far. These are clearly important things. So in this particular setting in Illinois, why do these sunset extensions and refinements to the statutes matter to firms that are just trying to get work and trying to manage risk? Why should they care?
I think the deal with the sunsets, really, there's no one that gains from that. It's really frustrating to hear from owners that are saying, we're trying to plan a program, not just plan one-off projects. And how do you do that when you have these arbitrary deadlines that, so you're trying to either squeeze a project in and it's for nothing. We don't do this with any other delivery method that we put these sunsets in. Otherwise, design bid build might have been gone a long time ago. And I think the same is also true on the practitioner side. You're trying to put your business plan together, and if there's a particular owner that you like doing work with, but you only want to do design build and they don't know if next year it's going to be design bid build, design build, it's not very good for planning purposes, I think. No consistency.
No, and I think the risk, and I don't think we've seen a sunset clause actually be enacted where they actually rip the authority away yet. I've never seen that or never heard of it happening. But there's always that risk that you get a legislature that is all of a sudden against something, and then they basically pull the rug out from underneath your feet. So probably that is the risk to practitioners or even public owners at that point, is that the legislature could turn on you, and then you've got to back up and do something different. Not a good situation, and hopefully we over time here we can get away from these sunset clauses and just forget about them.
And you raise an interesting point. You both have sort of mentioned that this doesn't happen with other delivery methods. Why would it happen with design build then? Is there a historical element at play there? What's the reason for this particular delivery method getting sunsetted?
The reason it happens, again, this is part of the political compromise that goes on when you're getting through where you have some folks that don't want to go along, and then folks will say, okay, well, we'll put a 10-year sunset in. If it's not working out, then you can always take it away.
It's
also guaranteed money for lobbyists.
Oh, fair enough.
Come back and we'll fix the problem all over again in 10 years.
Yeah. Again, I can speak for Washington State too. We started with what they call the Project Expansion Committee years ago, back in, right around 2000. And it was really to look at GCCM. And then it eventually went to job order contracting, and then design build. But they've always had a sunset clause, and it was for all of it. It was for all of alternative delivery. We were always a hard bid, design bid build state forever. And then they did GCCM, JOC, and then design build, and they've always had a sunset clause. And it was for exactly the same reason that Richard said. You were compromising with those that just had this design bid build mentality. And what if it fails? What if we find out it fails? Well, we'll put a cap on it, and then we can always authorize it again. If it doesn't work, we'll get rid of it. It always works. So they just keep kicking the can down the road. Eventually, you're going to get just common sense into the legislature and forget these things, and you're not going to have to worry about them again. I can't wait for that day to happen, but we aren't there yet.
Well, maybe if we get there too fast, we'll all be looking for more work. So, kind of like those lobbyists won't have anything to do, neither will we.
There will always be work to do.
Fair
I'm
enough.
trying to work myself out of a job here.
Just don't take the rest of us with you, Richard, okay? The Design Build Delivers podcast is brought to you by Archons, your technology optimization partner, helping design build teams streamline workflows with Autodesk solutions, expert support, and real-world training. Ready to work smarter and faster? Get tools, insights, and schedule your AI readiness check at archons.us/DBIA. So let's move to Wisconsin now. Once again, some numbers. AB 509, SB 461. This eliminates the DOT pilot and grants full design build authority without PDB. So what does that tell us about how states are thinking differently about traditional design build, about PDB, and about this difference in procurement?
It really says a lot about one's perspective, because I remember it was within 24 hours of our last legislative committee when I mentioned this, somebody had jumped, oh no, we had a setback on progressive design build. But what happened is Wisconsin, and we were involved in the original Wisconsin law. They had a pilot program. Every project, it was spelled out how they would do it, what range it would be, how it would be delivered. And it just, a lot of square pegs were trying to be fit into round holes here. And the bottom line is they hadn't even finished their first project yet. So they're still in the very beginning, and the DOT's working hard at it. I give them credit for that. With passage with this this was a compromise. On one hand, they wanted to give them full authority so they could have a plan, instead of having the arbitrary deadlines, what we just talked about. But at the same time, the industry did not feel confident going with progressive design build. And it's not because they don't have competent folks there, because they do, but even some of those very experienced design builders haven't done a progressive project yet. So I think it's more just putting some guardrails on. The fact we were able to get all this language taken off was a success.
The reality is, it's kind of a logical first step for legislators. Most states that are moving into an alternative delivery are doing so from a traditional design bid build approach. So low bid procurement. The financial risk is off the table for the public owner. It's probably just logical for them to take the baby steps and going into more of a traditional design build approach where they're getting a lump sum proposal at the end of the selection process. They kind of baby steps into going to progressive, which is, full on qualifications based selection. It's a good first step because they are taking the step, which is important. And then once you start to see, they see some success with the traditional design build procurement, then they start to work more into progressive, where they see that you've got firms in the state that have that experience level, and that whatever concern they might have had with the way that they're delivering the project is going to go away, and they'll start to move towards progressive.
One subtlety that I noticed in the bill was they didn't strip out any of the definitions of what progressive and CMAR, which also was not allowed. They kept all that language in the bill.
So they could easily take the next step.
If they really, really hated it, they could have taken all that line, because normally they do.
Yeah.
And they didn't. So I think that was intentional. So I feel good about where we're going there.
Well, that's good. So we're going to go from cheese to pizza, Wisconsin to New York. I don't know. I'm hungry. In New York, they're standing in a foot of snow, but we're also seeing multiple bills that are tied to large public benefit corporations and things at the county level. So authority at the county level. There are sewer and transit related entities, project labor agreements. It's New York. It's not easy. It's complex. So when design build authority is embedded in these structural governance changes, what does that signal to you about long-term delivery strategy?
I think for New York, on one hand, we got to keep in mind that historically, except for New York City, local design build authority has been either specifically for a county or it's project specific. We could have a whole nother show on why we think that is, but in order to, for instance, to do a project in upstate, political leadership has PLA language in all those, which isn't popular in upstate New York. That's one of the obstacles that you have there. All of our legislation in New York City, for example, has had that. That's kind of boilerplate. It's going to be PLA work in the city. But also part of that, too, is especially for those water projects, is what you're starting to see is local government specific. And also, too, we're starting to see more P3s, particularly in the water. Because, you have a lot of these aging systems. How do you rebuild an aging system? You have to have new money. Typically, P3s are done. It'll be a design, build, operate, maintain. That is a good thing. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, I think, coming down the road, because especially as we've seen, the feds are kind of stepping back from funding and clawing back some money in some cases. State and local governments are going to have to come up with alternative funding.
And let's go to Arizona and talk about HB 2692 that will authorize progressive design build for any public project. This is pretty broad. So if this passes, does that, and I realize try to make this not a yes or no question, does that fundamentally shift the competitive landscape, not just in Arizona, but in any state that might happen in?
The big thing with the bill in Arizona is Arizona's always been a state that's been very aggressive when it comes to delivery. The problem they had, though, is the transportation side of the bill was written so tight. So basically, all owners could use progressive under the existing law except for the DOT. A couple of years ago, there was an attempt that we were involved in, to try to change the law. It would have just modified the CMAR law. What they did here, and this is primarily AGC that pushed this, is this bill will allow progressive for all sectors, all projects. There was an amendment put onto the bill that, you guessed it, a sunset, that was put into the bill that will, I think, ease its passage through. I mean, when the bill was first introduced and then referred to 3 different committees, I thought, oh my gosh, someone's squawking about this. But it came out of the Appropriations Committee. It will have a 2030 sunset on it, which, while I don't like, I think it's going to be fine. We'll get that extended in 2030. Where I feel good about this is all the agencies in Arizona have a lot of experience in this, and I feel they're going to do well. You don't get extensions if your projects go south, and I don't think that's going to be a concern here. I feel very good about our chances on this bill. I think this bill will make it through now with the sunset compromise.
And how those things affect the landscape in these things is really depends on the public owner. I mean, we see this a lot where depending on how they issue their solicitations, how restrictive they are, is going to dictate the market. We saw it here in Washington State for a while, but it's the same with GCCM or CMAR, public CMAR, where you had to have experience in order to get a job, but there was only a very small handful of contractors that had the experience. So it kind of came down to chicken and egg thing. When they finally broadened what they accepted as a qualifying project to negotiated or GMP or CMAR for design build, then they opened up the market and people started getting the experience in those things. And there's some good people that have done a lot of these kind of projects. There's third-party construction management firms that operate in that marketplace that understand that. And hopefully the DOT will and the other ones will have enough sense to be wide open in the way they put the solicitations out, and they'll be able to attract great level of competition.
Not to go into all 50 states, but to sort of touch on a couple other ones and some issues that are showing up in states we haven't talked about. We are still seeing bills tied to liability limits, to labor provisions, licensing requirements, governance boards even. So these are sort of adjacent policy shifts. Also here we see warranty requirements in Michigan, licensing changes in Virginia. So how do these types of things indirectly affect design build teams?
The reason we see so many of these bills is all the construction stuff is in one section of the law. So if there's going to be a bill, for instance, in Illinois, we see these all the time on workers' compensation or maybe it's prevailing wage. Well, those are things that affect the whole construction industry, whether it's design build or not design build. But we still have to track those because sometimes all it takes is a word change here or there, and all of a sudden it goes from affecting you indirectly to affecting you directly. The same with like a lot of these license change bills. I mean, generally every year we have a battle between the AIA and the landscape architects. You'll get licensing battles over stuff like that. Also, too, as design build expands more, our world gets bigger. And so there's more and more legislation that's going to start to dip into our section of the law. Or as it becomes more popular, folks want to use it, so they'll amend their laws as well. So we have to stay on top of that.
The liability law is a big one. We're seeing this here, even in Washington State this year. We're seeing a labor liability law come in that's likely to pass, despite industry opposition, which places the general contractor liable for all unpaid wages, even of sub-tier and sub-sub-tier subcontractors, which is hard to manage. Again, we're bad guys, so we have a tendency to get piled on by the legislature. But like Richard said, and he's right, it affects everybody in the industry, and it really is not specific to any kind of delivery method. And in some ways, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with the liability limits, liability laws, labor provisions, PLAs, licensing things. Another licensing thing I know we're running up against is interior designers. They're not architects sometimes, they are interior designers, but they have their own certifications. Where do we go with that? So there's a lot of things there that are kind of outside of the normal things we face in design build authority, but they're things that ultimately affect how you conduct projects. And you got to pay attention to all that stuff. It's all impactful at some level. And sometimes things sneak in there that are going to impact even design build authority or how we approach design build.
We've talked about what's happening around the country. We're looking at bills in states from coast to coast, north to south. A lot of this, especially in places like Missouri and in Illinois, will call for in-person advocacy, to make things come out the way that's best for the industry. People have to be there. So the catch is there aren't, I don't want to say there aren't a lot, but not every AEC professional out there has set foot in a state capital. There are lots of people who are like, that's not my job, man. But everything that happens is going to impact those people as well. So what does it look like to engage as a industry professional in that type of setting, like in Missouri, like in Illinois, somewhere that having people on the ground is really going to move the needle?
All politics is local. every association has a lobbyist of some sort, and legislators see them every day, and that's important. But when folks actually come and talk to their legislators, if they're sending them emails, if they're talking to them, they assume that for every person that does that, there's 10 others that are thinking the same thing that aren't. And that is really impactful, especially when bad things are happening. And here's the thing to think about too. Even a small contractor is going to be a major employer in a small town. And, that's why contractors, the designers, all of them, they all hire people. They're employers in their towns, and that's impactful to a legislator. And they do not want to be crossways with their constituents. And also, on the other hand, too, they want to see economic opportunities for their constituents. So if you can say, while this may just sound like a delivery method, this is helping us employ people. This is helping us to be able to donate to programs in the community. To really see where that local impact is important. And the fact that we have a delivery method that saves time and money, that goes a long way too. But if you put those two together, you really have a combination. And Vince comes from the practitioners. He can probably tell you firsthand what it's like when he goes and sees legislators.
Yeah, I mean, Richard's right. Everything happens at the local level, but legislators want to hear from their constituents. There's nothing more important than an in-person meeting with a legislator and making a trip to the Capitol and meeting with them, or even testifying before a committee on a specific bill and things that you're fighting or you're trying to be a proponent for. It's important to get involved. DBIA, AGC, AIA, ABC, all those industry organizations all have legislative committees and advocacy groups, sometimes locally, sometimes at the state level. Get involved in those. You can learn a lot by just getting involved. I'd like to say it, but there's safety in numbers. When you're going to talk to legislators, if you're with a group of people that are all advocating for the same thing or against something, there's safety in numbers when you're testifying. And when you're speaking with a common voice, it's more impactful to committees or to legislators that they're hearing from the same group of people across the state that are telling them that how things are going to either positively or negatively impact their business and how it ultimately can impact the state.
Another thing that I've always felt has been important is just the relationships that you build our members. If you build a relationship with your legislators, well, these legislators are just regular people. Most of them are not designers. Most of them are not contractors. When they have an issue that comes up and they're not really sure, it's really handy for them to be able to get on the phone and say, hey, Vince, I got this bill that comes up that's dealing with design build. What is that all about? Because they hear from hired guns all day long, but if they hear from one of their constituents who they trust, that's really powerful. I urge all of our members to develop those relationships. If you got a representative that goes to the same store, is in the same church or synagogue or whatever, you go and you visit them. Make sure they know who you are.
And if you want to take a little bit of a different route, instead of walking up to your local congresspeople and going, hi, I'm going to harass you from now on because I'm your neighbor, which is a perfectly viable way to do this. But if you want to take a little more structured approach, DBIA does have several resources to help you find your way in there if you don't like to be the one to approach somebody in the middle of Publix. Speaking of some of those resources, we have at DBIA model legislation and a state statute report that gets updated really, really quickly and often. So how can a firm or how can an owner use those resources before something is introduced? So instead of waiting to see, I think we're going to lose our authority, how can they take those proactive steps?
All of our materials are available in the bookstore. I was pleasantly surprised to see 259 people had gotten our model ledge out last year. And a lot of folks, to answer your question more directly, sometimes you'll see people do have bills before they've seen our model legislation. Generally, when you see that, it's because a particular firm or, they may want to get bill introduced that will maybe help them, and it's written in such a way. An owner may just draft a bill because they have a specific need and maybe they didn't know who DBIA was. But we're finding though it's getting used. It was interesting. I just had we just sent a copy over to the folks up in Massachusetts. Some of the industry groups are looking at it now. The governor had talked about a progressive design build pilot program in her governor's recommendations for the budget. Within days, we had folks calling for our model legislation. So, that's a good thing. We want to get it used. And I'll let Vince speak more to that, because really Vince was the energy behind our model ledge as it stands today.
Well, thanks. It was a bit of a group effort, but the other document that goes along with that is called the Guide to Enact Design Build Legislation. It kind of is the cover document over the model legislation document. And it talks about a lot of the stuff we've been talking about in this session here with, talking to legislators and building consensus, industry coalitions, things like that, how to draft legislation, and then it refers back to the model legislation. And the model legislation is really drafted around, what DBIA and the board recently is focusing on, and that is qualification-based deliveries, best value and progressive. And it gives you the kind of the good structure on how to develop basic guidelines for that within legislation. So it's a really great document on that regard. And then the one we just released is what we call a model ordinance document, which is modeled after the model legislation document, but meant more for maybe more local governments. It's structured a little bit more formally than the model legislation document is, but it follows the same guides. It's got the same glossary of terms. It is identical in a lot of ways. We want to make sure there's consistency and all the definitions and things like that. And it talks only about best value and progressive. But both documents really focus heavily on DBIA's best practices and really focusing heavily on that, which is really where we're really headed in the legislative side, is when we do get full authority across the country, is to train on best practices and make sure that everybody's doing everything right, because that's going to keep the authority intact and continue to grow it.
We've got resources, we've got stuff you can get in the bookstore. Again, all will be linked. The beauty of the majority of DBIA's resources is they are free. You just have to go download them. But we also have our conferences, which are another important space that a lot of these conversations begin, they end, they develop. And at the spring specialty conferences in April, we have a dedicated legislative session. So let's say someone's working in operations, pre-construction, executive leadership, something that isn't directly legislation related. Why would they need to make time? Or what would you tell them if they were like, well, I don't really want to go to the legislative session. Why should I?
It's going to be part of the transportation aviation conference. And I mean, the one thing it does do is it gives you updates as to where current legislation is across the country. That's one of the things Richard's going to be presenting on during the session. And obviously, a lot of the legislatures across the country are in session right now. So things are very fluid. So we try to be as up to date as we can so people can get an idea of what's going on in their specific region or their specific state. The timing of this is obviously very critical, being where most of the legislatures are in session right now. The other thing it does is it gives them an idea of what our committee is up to, things that we're working on for this session, and the things that we're doing. We're trying to focus on specific advocacy ideas for each region and each state, kind of look at each state and where they are, what are the next steps we need to take? And then how do we design the advocacy or what the committee can do to support that moving forward over the next several years? And whether it's expanding DB authority into different market sectors where they don't have it now. And it could come down to, for example, in Washington State, where we do have full authority, is it in training? Is it in DBI training best practices? And how do we best do that type of thing? So that's where people are going to learn. And they're going to learn where they can potentially plug in, whether it's in the advocacy side or even at the committee level or other committees, where they can offer their input and really get involved in DBIA.
I think anybody that watches a session, they're going to come out of there, particularly if they're looking around the country and looking at areas that maybe they want to expand. They're going to be able to find out where we have design build authority, what trends are moving. I think also with this panel too, we are going to go into the weeds a little bit on some of these states that we discussed today. We didn't touch on Texas, the Southwest much. We'll dig into that a little bit more. We'll touch on some of those other issues that we discussed today, but it'll be very in-depth, and you'll have the best looking panel of the entire show.
Wait, I'm not going to be on it, so how's that possible?
Well, maybe you are.
I'm kidding. State legislation can feel distant until it isn't. A sunset clause gets extended, a pilot becomes permanent, a threshold disappears, or a familiar bill reappears with just enough new language to make everybody say, "Haven't we seen this before?" As Vince said, bad bills never really go away, they just come back with slightly different wording, and as Richard reminded us, all politics is local, which means engagement matters. To learn more about how you can get involved, visit DBIA's website, dbia.org, for model legislation, state statute reports, and advocacy resources. Or you can just check the show notes where I've linked all the things we've talked about so you can get to them all in one nice place. And if you're attending DBIA's Design Build for Transportation and Aviation Conference in April, I've also linked that registration for you. Don't miss the legislative session for a deeper look at what's unfolding right now. Thank you again to Archons, an Autodesk Platinum partner, for supporting the Design Build Delivers podcast. I am Erin Looney. Thank you for listening. We will see you next time, hopefully before the next sunset clause makes that annual appearance.